Welcome, brave souls, to the spine-chilling, heart-pounding, and slightly damp review of Cold Fear. Are you ready to face the terror of mutant humans, creepy Russian soldiers, and very slippery decks? Well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to 30 FPS Game Reviews. Today we're diving headfirst into the stormy seas of Cold Fear, a game that proves that the real horror isn't the monsters. It's trying to stay upright on a boat in a storm. Will we survive the nightmarish waves and horrifying creatures? Or will we get seasick and call it a day? Grab your life vests and let's set sail. Okay, now that I maybe have your attention, nothing I just said even remotely begins to shine a light on this game. From being held back by the hardware of the time to downright horrid controls and plot holes the size of Kansas, this game is probably one that should have honestly been left in the graveyard of forgotten IP, or just had the rights left with Namco. Let it be known, I will be touching on a lot of negative things, but I'm not trying to bash the game for the sake of bashing it, just sharing my honest opinions and thoughts experienced while spending a few hours lost on an oil rig. Cold Fear was originally going to be developed by Darkworks into a Time Crisis entry under Namco, but Ubisoft bought the rights and the game turned into what we have before us today. But in all honesty, this game came out 2 months after Resident Evil 4 in March of 2005. With that in mind, I know video game development is a long and expensive process, but Cold Fear would have benefited immensely from taking a lot more out of Resident Evil 4's book and even waiting until the PlayStation 3 release, so it wouldn't have been so limited by the hardware. A very common feature of the PlayStation 2 that if used right can be amazing is frame interlacing, which is a way of smoothing animations between frames by having them, for lack of a better term, overlap. Like having this frame being frame 1, and then let's call this frame over here frame 2. If we were to interlace and kind of overlap them, we would now have 3 frames and a smoother transition between frame 1 and frame 3. This is an extremely oversimplified explanation of how interlacing works, but it gets the point across because I just do a little bit of research and read and pretend to be smart like everyone else on YouTube. Now, one downside of interlacing is that if major movement occurs, kinda like what we see on the ship right here, the movement can appear blurred since it's mixing all of these movements across different frames instead of them being displayed on their own. This happened many times when the ship was rocking back and forth throughout the storm. The movement of the boat is just so drastic and the camera moves separately, so we're left with just about everything being blurred. Also on the topic of the boat, Darkworks made its own engine to deal with the rocking of the ship and movement of both the playable character and the NPCs while it was rocking around. I gotta say that's a really cool move by them, and it honestly was a cool touch in the game, but because of the rocking, there are 9 different directional animations based on the direction the boat is moving. This led to there being over 900 different animations for a possible 5,000 different movement animations. But there were also a few moments where I'd kill an enemy on the deck, and a wave would hit shortly after, causing the body to just slide very slowly. It was a great idea, but just my opinion, was implemented in a very odd way and held back by the hardware of the PlayStation 2. With all of this in mind, my tiny lizard brain speculates that all of this extra graphical and engine data severely limited the scope of the game. It takes place on a whaling vessel and an oil drilling rig, and that's it. In my head, if they had waited for the PlayStation 3, tested the engine and graphical overhauls implemented on new hardware, and expanded the map to make the playable area bigger, instead of just running back and forth on an oil rig for 6 hours, this game would have been much more memorable and iconic. But certain areas of both the ship and the oil rig load in batches. So some rooms load together so there isn't a loading screen going between the kitchen to the galley, which was nice, but sometimes led to a little bit of confusion. When close by to an enemy, the character's heart would beat, and you could hear them scream even though they would be in the next room over. Speaking of enemies, their design was probably the best decision made when making this game. There are 5.5 different enemies encountered during the game. First up, we have the exocells, which were originally found inside what was thought to be an oil reserve. Instead, the drill brought up a bunch of these guys that kinda look like facehuggers. They also hold the entire blame for the outbreak encountered on the ship and the oil rig. These little guys crawl into a host's mouth and take control of the brain, turning it into something remarkably close to the Ganados from Resident Evil 4. These things also lead to plot holes all over the place that I'll touch on a little bit when we get to the story. Onto the Ganados clones, they're called exomutants. There are 2 variants of these, which is why I counted a half enemy, because there's literally no discernible difference between the 2 aside from their character model. These guys only die when their brain is destroyed, since the exocells have taken control of it. Now in my head, I imagine the exocell also fusing to the brain to take control, since there's no real explanation on it. But sometimes when these mutants were killed, an exocell would come out of the body and either attack or try to find another host to take control of. But only sometimes, which just doesn't make sense to me why only sometimes they came out, but most of the time they didn't. And they don't even exist in the game until we reach a certain point in the story where we learn that they're the cause of the infection. Just some little things that don't really add up in my eyes, but definitely confused my simple brain. The next enemy we encounter is the Exoshade. These things were probably the dogs that were tested on and broke loose. They attack super fast and like to run away and ambush from vents along the ceiling. Not really much else to say about these guys. They're typically pretty easy to deal with when they're alone, since the shotgun just keeps knocking them over and you can stun lock them until they're gone. The encounter in the room right before the last boss has 2 of these guys, and it took all of my ammo to kill them because they just kept running around and hiding. Probably the worst enemy we encounter in the game is the Exospectre. These little Spitfires are invisible. A note somewhat explains this. The host was administered a partial antidote before having the exocell forced on them, so I guess it kinda changed how the exocell took over the host. Again, not really explained too well. These guys are absolutely brutal in every encounter. They're impossible to see. The only way we can really see them is to shoot a steam valve near them or keep a close eye on the laser to see if it's being placed on them. They also have an enormous amount of health and can grapple you, which gives you a chance to critically hit them, but they drain your stamina or resistance in this game super quick before you can even get the chance to finish the QuickTime event. Our last enemy is the Exomass, which honestly just reminds me of the Chargers from Left 4 Dead 2. These guys have their contamination grown mainly in their left hand instead of their head. There's part of a note that explains a little bit about subject G3-04. It states that he mutates after 14 minutes, has a resistance to everything, including fire, and the only way to kill him is to blow up that giant limb. So I'm going to spoil some bits of the story before we head into it, just to show you how stupid some of these notes and plot points are, and how they were just completely ignored when developing the storyline. So these exomasses, they developed in 14 minutes. There's another note that says the average time to infect is 25 minutes. Twice during the entire gameplay, our player becomes infected, and both times we take nearly an hour to find an antidote, and both times we're unconscious for an unknown amount of time. The first time we find an actual antidote. The second time, we use an antidote on an NPC and then pass out, and eventually wake up completely fine. But both times, we're unconscious when we're getting infected, and we don't know how much time has passed until we wake up. It honestly feels like they just had one part of the team write a story, and then had ChatGPT write the lore notes. There's just way too many conflicting and ignored bits of information that the lore behind these exocells just kind of collapses on itself. Probably the weakest aspect of the game is its saving system. It's like an optional autosave. Reaching certain points in the story will offer a save when trying to enter a room. Now I appreciate it offering a save, usually before a big fight or something similar, but if I'm playing a game like this, I'd rather save after, so I can get off the game feeling accomplished and not have to come back and do this encounter again. Or, just save whenever. The controls for this game were just straight up not user-friendly. There's no inventory, 4 hotkeys for weapons, but a total of 8 guns, and no guide or tooltip on how to switch weapons. At one point, I picked up a grenade launcher that replaced the hotkey for the pistol, the most important gun in the game. And I had to actually exit the game back to the main menu to even see the control scheme. Oh, look at that. L2 and R2 are cycle through weapons. In the game, we have 2 methods of aiming. One gives us an over-the-shoulder view, like how RE4 used, but we can also click in the left stick to give us a more traditional survival horror aim that just raises the gun but keeps the camera tied to wherever it was, which isn't very useful in a game that requires you to get headshots to defeat enemies. The camera was also a little tricky to get used to. At some points it gave you that traditional survival horror up in the corner of the room camera view, and at other points it would just switch to the over the shoulder and move around with the character, not just forward and back, but also turn with him. This made movement a little difficult at some points, as the switch had very little rhyme or reason and caused a second of disorientation. There's also a melee, which is super necessary when the enemies are up close and the ship is rocking, because their movement is super sporadic and the rocking makes aiming near impossible up close. But even though we find a note at the very beginning saying melee is a necessity, there's no, hey, flex that circle muscle to melee while aiming. And honestly, it just left me panicking when enemies were up close. As previously stated, there's no inventory, which leads to an extremely lackluster ammo system. There's a hard cap on how much ammo you can pick up, and medkits are used on pickup. This entire system was awful in my opinion. If I didn't use a gun or need healing, I just have to walk past and leave it, trying my best to keep a mental note of, hey, there's a medkit or shotgun ammo in the third room of the Habitat Center. But wait, guess what else? There's no map, so all these items are gone like a fart in the wind. And since there's no map, the only way of knowing what room you're about to go in is by reading the Russian on the wall next to it, which you have to point your gun at to read from an unreasonably close distance. But I think the devs knew that all of this was kind of a shortcoming in the game and placed an armory and a med bay in both of these areas, with unlimited uses to refill ammo and health. You just have to remember how to get back there. And I have two things left to touch on before we get into the story. These last two things just bothered me personally, weren't really a huge problem. The first being the amount of bullets needed to kill an enemy. Some normal exomutants would take 2, 3, or even 4 pistol shots to take down, which is completely fine. But if I were to use the AK against them, it'd take over 6 consistent headshots to take down. I said this in the Obscure review. I'm no gun expert by any means, but I'm pretty sure that bigger bullet means bigger hole. So I have no idea why the AK was weaker. It almost seems to me like damage was tied to the rate of fire of the weapon, so that their damage per second stayed consistent instead of it being realistic. Now the last thing that really bothered me is the shadows. They were just busted. They'd go through anything the character was standing on, so if you were elevated, it would cause 2 entire shadows to be cast. One on the elevation that you're standing on, and another shadow below you, instead of whatever is cut off being casted on the floor below. There were also many times in the game where the light wasn't actually originating from light sources, but rather from the middle of the cells of rooms that were loaded, causing the shadows to be way off from the light source in the room. Now that the trash talking's out of the way and we all know what we're in for, let's hop into the story. The game begins with a US Navy SEAL team deploying on a Russian whaler, the Eastern Spirit. They're attacked and killed by unseen beings that literally just rip them apart. This mission was overseen by CIA Special Agent Jason Bennett, who's somewhere else entirely and orders any other government vessels in the vicinity to investigate. His call's picked up by the US Coast Guard ship, the USCGC Ravenswood, which heads straight to the Eastern Spirit. The crew of the Ravenswood splits into teams, but within moments of boarding, only one remains: Tom Hansen, a former Special Forces soldier. As he enters the interior of the Eastern Spirit, he gets attacked by a bunch of Russians, which is one of the most common enemies he faces aboard the Eastern Spirit. He eventually finds several mutilated bodies, including that of the Ravenswood captain's, Lieutenant Lansing, which gives him the code to the radio tower. Afterwards, he discovers that these creatures are called exocells, and they were discovered on a Russian oil rig, the Star of Sakhalin, which is owned by Colonel Dmitry Yusupov, a member of the Russian Mafia, alongside his partner, Major Yuri Yanishenko, and his team of mercenaries. Yusupov realized the exocells were parasitic organisms and brought Dr. Viktor Kamsky to the Sakhalin to begin experimenting. These experiments led to the discovery that exocells could reanimate dead bodies, as well as making an antidote. Once Hansen makes it to the radio room, he calls out for help, but instead he's answered by Bennett, who tells him that Yusupov is on board and must be captured. Bennett tells Hansen that if he finds Yusupov, the CIA will get him off the ship. Once Yusupov is located, he tells Hansen that Anna Kamsky, Victor's daughter, is on board and must be saved. Yusupov brought her on the ship to blackmail Victor into turning the exocells into weapons. Once his monologue's over, an exocell bursts out of his chest, killing him. Once Hansen finds Anna, they go to the radio room to try to contact her father. They manage to contact the oil rig, but Bakarev tells Anna that Kamsky is missing and pleads with her not to return. But she's a stubborn girl and tells Bakarev that she'll see him soon. Take note of this interaction because in a minute, it doesn't really make too much sense. Hansen and Anna turn the ship around to head back to the oil rig, but because the seas are so rough, they're unable to dock with the platform. So they head up to the crow's nest and jump onto the oil rig as soon as the two collide. Hansen makes the jump, but Anna doesn't, so he dives in after her and gets knocked unconscious. And this is the part where Hansen gets infected. I just want to point out, take note of what he's laying on while he gets infected. And now, look at what he's laying on when he wakes up. The whole environment's different, leading me to believe that he was knocked out for an extremely long amount of time and somehow moved. I don't know, just doesn't make sense. But Hansen soon finds Bakarev and gets his antidote. Bakarev also tells Hansen that he has to disable the radio jammers around the rig so that he can contact Bennett. Remember what I said a minute ago? If there's a jammer on the oil rig, how did we just talk to them? Anyway, Bakarev tells Hansen he needs to find Inoshenko to get past a retinal scanner. But not too long after, Bakarev is dragged into an air duct and killed. Eventually, Hansen finds and kills Inoshenko, removing his eye so that he's able to get into the radio jammer room. Once inside, he shoots the radio jammer to deactivate it. He then hears from Bennett and is told that he must find Kamsky's laptop and transmit the exocell research. While this is happening, Anna is rescued from the sea by a large creature and left in a lab, where she is then infected by an exocell. Seeing this happen on a security monitor, Hansen races to find an antidote and give it to Anna. I'm going to put my in-game timestamps here, just so you know how long it took for us to find an antidote and then get it to Anna. Oh yeah, but on our way to find the antidote, we pass out and get infected as well. So add maybe 30 minutes to this timer that we just don't see. So after about 30 minutes of in-game time, we find the antidote. And then after about another 30 minutes, we find Anna, pet her like a cat, and administer the antidote. But not before we pass out. But somehow, Hansen is miraculously okay, and Bennett contacts him, promising that if he gives him the research, he'll save Anna. On the entire other side of the oil rig, Hansen eventually finds the laptop and transmits the antidote data to Bennett, but nothing else. This makes Bennett just start yelling at Hansen. But him and Anna agree to just blow up the rig with C4. At this point, we have to run through the entire oil rig again and plant C4 charges and run away before they can get us. During this time, we learn that Papa Kamsky has gone completely insane. He infected himself with the exocell serum and released the imprisoned exos on the rig and the ship. He did this so he could be safe during his metamorphosis. Once Hansen's planted all the charges, he heads up to the helicopter pad to meet Anna, but before they can take off, they're attacked by Papa Kamsky. This is probably one of the weirdest fights I've ever done. It consists of two phases. In the first phase, Papa Kamsky only goes after Anna, so we have to shoot him in the back and distract him, and when he comes to attack us, dodge the attack. We have to do this several times while Anna goes around the perimeter of the helipad, planting C4 charges. Once Anna's done, she runs away to the helicopter, and Papa Kamsky targets us. And this is where it gets really weird, because we move at a snail's pace, and the whole point of this phase is to dodge his attacks and get grabbed. But to dodge his attacks, you have to sprint, and sprinting uses your stamina. But when he grabs you, you also lose your stamina. So in a weird way, this fight felt like a Dark Souls boss, where you had to just run out of the way at the exact right time to not waste more stamina than you had to, so that when he grabbed you, you had enough stamina to do the critical strike that we talked about earlier. After dodging his attacks and getting grabbed enough times, we eventually defeat him and make our way over to the helicopter. We take off and Anna says goodbye to her father, and Hansen does too, before he blows up the oil rig, giving us the most anticlimactic 80s action movie ending ever. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and comment down below what game you want to see next time. Also, we just got a new 10-year-old foster cat, and he is the sweetest old man ever. So if you want to help support us and get him some toys and treats, consider joining the Patreon, and I'll make sure you guys know exactly how you're supporting Little Butter here. But until then, I want to thank all the Patreon supporters I have now. You guys are absolutely amazing. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye!